The bright side of addiction is recovery. If you are in recovery, or you know or love someone who is, or simply want to know more about the recovery process, or maybe you're a bit concerned about someone you know who's having a problem with alcohol or other drugs, this is the podcast for you as we carry the message of hope and the promise of recovery. And a reminder, you can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. In this edition of Recovery Coast to Coast, a visit with a great American poet who was 40 years sober when he passed away 10 years ago this month. His name, Jack McCarthy. Now, Jack actually went into recovery 50 years prior to his passing, but he had what he referred to as a one-night stand with Lady Alcohol, proving that you can always come back. The recovery community will always accept you, always love you, and always be there for you. Here is a quick clip from today's podcast.
I did a lot of things wrong in the beginning. It took me a while to really get into the 12 steps. And consequently, it took me a long time before I felt that the promises were coming true for me. Today, all of those promises have come true. My favorite promise is we will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. And that was the last one that came true for me. But I think what that promise is saying, back at the beginning, we have to turn our lives over to a sponsor. We cannot trust. When I go into my own head, I'm in dangerous territory.
And we'll close out the podcast with some reflections on recovery from an actress in long-term recovery, Ali McGraw. She'll talk about self-worth and more. I'm Neil Scott, host of Recovery Coast to Coast, and I want to begin by expressing my gratitude to you for listening. I realize your time's pretty important, and there are many, many choices you have, many podcasts you could be listening to. I thank you for listening to ours. Our website is recoverycoasttocoast.org, and again, you'll find all of our podcasts there. Following 15 years of nightly broadcasting on iHeartRadio in Seattle, we have now upgraded to a national podcast, which is available to anyone at any time, featuring interviews with everyday people in recovery, as well as clinicians and authors, recovering celebrities and newsmakers who offer the promise of hope and the reality of recovery, plus well-vetted resources for individuals, families, and friends. We invite you to enjoy the podcast and to share it. Share it with your friends. Recovery is an American way of life. A reminder, our email address, in case you want to get in touch, we'd love to hear from you, is recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Recovery Coast to Coast is supported by Sundown M Ranch, one of America's oldest, least expensive, and most successful treatment programs. In March, they're going to celebrate 55 years of successfully treating individuals and families from all across the country. People always ask, what happens in a treatment center? What do they actually do? How do they get the patient well? Well, first of all, for those who need detox, they can take care of that first, making sure that alcohol and other drugs are out of your system. The program includes a thorough assessment, individual therapy, education on the disease, group therapy, exercise, an introduction to 12-step meetings, and a complete integrated system of care that includes continuing care. When a patient leaves and returns to the community, that is very important. It's a transitional bridge. Equally important is the family program. Family members must understand the complexity of the disease and their role in the recovery process. By the way, a lot of folks say they can't afford to go to treatment. What I always say is you can't afford not to go to treatment. Addiction is a life or death situation. The good news is that once people find recovery, they become better than better. The bright side of addiction is recovery. Now, when you leave treatment at Sundown, you'll have all the tools necessary to begin and continue your life in long-term recovery. But, it's up to the individual to use the tools in navigating everyday life one day at a time. Sundown knows the importance of recovery enhancement. How is your recovery better today than it was yesterday? And treatment at Sundown doesn't cost, it saves. It saves lives, it saves families, jobs, and so much more. The cost of treatment at Sundown among the lowest in the country because, well, first of all, they're a not for profit organization. They own their own land on 30 acres at the mouth of the Yakima River Canyon, not far from Seattle, and their staff is top notch. They're well paid. Many of them actually went through Sundown, and they know the value of good treatment. Now, even if you're not looking for a treatment center at the moment, check out their webpage. I believe you'll be impressed. Sundown.org, located just outside of Yakima, Washington, where long-term recovery begins. Well, the coffee's ready. Time now for coffee and conversation. And today I share my conversation with legendary American poet Jack McCarthy, whose final book of poetry is called Drunks and Other Poems of Recovery. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. My co-host for this conversation was my good friend Mike Hickey, himself a Seattle-based poet and a person in long-term recovery. Here now is our interview with Jack McCarthy that was done shortly before his passing. He is a man who is constitutionally a stranger to moderation in any of its forms. Welcome to Recovery Coast to Coast.
It is a joy and a pleasure to be here.
You've been in recovery 40 years. Take us back to the very beginning, because I know off the air you said that it actually had been 50 years, but there was a little research you had to do.
Yeah, I had a one-night stand in 1972. Often if I tell my story, I begin with that because I think that's what everybody wants to know. You know, when you pick up after 9.5 years, what happened? What went wrong? If you started out so well and did so many things right. What it comes down to is it took me a long time to see it, but it comes down to a moment in 1968. And I knew that things had started going sour in 68. My first sobriety started in 62. My one-night stand was in 72. It came down to my wedding day. And my first wife, I'm not, going to blame her. She was very supportive of my AA activity. But when I thought about the wedding ceremony itself, the moment when I was walking back down the aisle with my beautiful new bride on my arm, what was in my head at that moment was, now I have everything I want in life. I don't have to grow anymore. And I never said that out loud, never said it to my wife, never said it to my sponsor. But for the next 4 years, that colored the way I approached the program and my life as a whole. And in those 4 years, my life slipped into a chaos and a despair that was every bit as bad as what brought me into the program in the first place.
Were you still going to meetings?
The last year, I did not get to many meetings. And I had always been an eager beaver for meetings. 7:30, I'd look at my watch. If I'm not doing anything, why am I not at a meeting tonight? But in that last year, I signed up to do a job, a one-year contract, and I had no reason to think that the job would keep me away from meetings, but it did. It made it very difficult to get to meetings. And in the course of that year, meetings lost their importance to me. It became more and more natural just to stay away. And when I did have a chance to go, I often wouldn't. I thought that I had enough basis, enough strength in the program to carry me through that year. I found out that the only strength I have is the strength that I get from meetings. Without meetings, I have no lifeline. I'm lost.
I'm delighted to have Mike Hickey as my co-host. Mike is Seattle's poet populist. He's been a co-host on the program many, many times.
Good evening, Neil, and thank you for having me back. In addition to being in long-term recovery, you're also a poet. Can I talk a little bit about the beginnings of poetry and how you happened to get into poetry, and then how it happened to merge in with recovery?
Yeah, well, you're asking for a long story.
We have a lot of time.
I got sober, as I said, in 1962. I had dropped out of college in 1959, and in 64, I went back to finish college,
Where'd you go to school?
Dartmouth.
Hmm.
I should go back a little further probably. When I was 14, I got a scholarship to Phillips Exeter Academy, which is one of the top prep schools in the country. At the time, they used to send about 20% of the senior class would go straight to Harvard. I was doing great there. I had a good family. My father was in the program, and it was kind of an ideal family life. I had a lot of support. In September of my senior year, my mother was killed in a car accident, and in March, my father died of a heart attack. Within weeks of that, I had picked up my first drink, and I was off and running. I don't really make a causal connection there. I think the seeds of alcoholism were in me already. And I'm grateful that my parents were not around to watch what was going to happen to me in the next 5 years.
You say your father was in program.
Yeah.
How long had he been sober?
He must have gotten sober during World War II. I think AA in Boston began with an article in the Boston Post by a sports columnist who interviewed a catcher for the Cleveland Indians named Raleigh Hemsley, who was in the program. And the way my father talked about that article, I kind of think that's when he got started, or it led to his coming to AA, certainly. There is some evidence that he was drinking when he died. I don't know whether it began after my mother's death, but there was a bottle beside his bed when he was found dead in the morning. So he didn't make it. He must have had 10 plus years in the program.
So after your parents passed away, you were off and running in your addiction.
I was off and running, but the day of my father's funeral, the people from Exeter came down and told me I had a full scholarship to Dartmouth. And that Dartmouth's a big drinking school. It's up in the North Country.
Mm-hmm.
No women around to hinder us.
Full steam ahead.
Yeah, full steam ahead. And I lasted about a year and a half at Dartmouth. But in '64, sober now, almost 2 years, I wanted to go back to Dartmouth. And they took me. Now, all of that leads up to, now we're almost ready to answer the question, how did I become a poet?
Right.
Just before Christmas vacation at the Dartmouth Film Society, they showed a film of Dylan Thomas's Child's Christmas in Wales, and with Thomas himself doing the narration. I had tears running down my cheeks from just the way he used the English language. And I thought, I want to do that. And to this day, in some of my best poems, I can still hear echoes of A Child's Christmas in Wales. I had an experience, let me see, would have been back, well, within the last 10 years, I went back to Exeter for a reunion. And I have an Exeter poem about a Latin teacher, and a terrifying Latin teacher.
Aren't they all?
Yes,
And
right.
the first part of the poem is intended to be funny about the way he abused us. I did that at the dinner at the 45th reunion. I have had standing ovations on occasion. That night I got a swarming ovation. As I came down from the podium, my classmates came up and surrounded me and began to bombard me with their stories about this Latin teacher.
Right.
When I got back to my table, I was sitting next to the guy who had been regarded as the critic with a capital C in our class. I had one essay published in the school literary magazine. His comment on that in his story, George so-and-so doesn't tell us enough. In his essay, Jack tells us too much. And that was my first experience with literary criticism. That guy's sitting next to me. And I sat down, and after things had calmed down, of A Child's Christmas in Wales.
Wow.
I mean,
oh my.
what an ear that guy must have had, because among all of my poems, that poem is the last thing I would have expected that about. He caught it.
Mike?
Well, I wanted to go back to poetry a little bit. Dylan Thomas is not a bad example of poets, great artists who have allowed drink and drug to destroy their physical lives. And I just wondered what you felt, what the connection is between art and alcohol or art and addiction, and why some artists seem to be unable to distinguish their two lives.
That's above my grade level, answering that question. There is a terrific high that comes with creating something that you think is good. But that sense that you have done something is very difficult to attain. But once you've felt it, you want that high. That's the best connection I can make. If I can't get it through what I'm writing today, there's an easy answer to that. And it's to go get it somewhere else.
To get it artificially if you can't get it organically.
Yeah.
And then it seems like, from my experience in recovery, a lot of people who are into addiction are using drugs and alcohol to mask resentments, pain that they feel from the past. And it's like maybe for some artists, their art allows them, at least for that moment, to transcend that pain and that bitterness. But then if do it and maintain that level, that some people go out and they use alcohol, just the pain they're unwilling to face either in their art or in their personal lives.
What alcohol and drugs do, I think the first thing that goes is the faculty for self-criticism. And sometimes for an artist, it becomes, that faculty is itself a stumbling block. Because I start writing something and I get 4 lines into it and I think, oh, this sucks. You know, I have to shut that critic up in order to get to that 5th line. I have known a lot of artists and poets who routinely try to lubricate their way over that hurdle, because if they can just get enough down, then they can go back and edit it and produce something good. Well, I have a daughter who is a fabulous writer, but she doesn't know it. She can't, that critic has her stopped. I mean, she'll get excited about something and say, oh, damn it, Shakespeare already said this. Who wants to hear my version?
Right. I think it was Hemingway who said if you write drunk, you have to edit sober. I think there are some people who are just unwilling to edit sober, even if you're not talking about drugs and alcohol, that the self-criticism is just too much for them. And sometimes I think it's important to distinguish the writer from the rewriter.
Yeah.
Would you grace us with a poem or two?
Yeah, I would love to. This particular poem I wrote in 1992. I did it at AA meetings for several years, and I found out that if I was going to be speaking and I thought I might do the poem, I'd better bring 8 or 10 copies with me, because people would want copies, and I would hand them out freely. When I first got on the internet in the year 2000, the poem was there ahead of me. I have found it on websites from here to Australia, Israel, Saudi Arabia.
Divine positioning.
I got invited to a convention in Spain about 5 years ago on the strength of this poem. The origin of it, when I first came around AA in Boston, and most of the meetings were speaker meetings, and I loved speaking at meetings. That thing about the sound of my own voice is a justifiable criticism as far as I'm concerned. One of the things I always wished that I could talk about was all of the drunks who lived and died before there was an AA program to come to, and the absolute hopelessness of their condition. And I could never bring myself to talk about it. In 1992, I was just getting serious about writing poetry. It occurred to me that maybe this was a way that I could talk about that in a poem. And I wrote this poem. It's called Drunks. We died of pneumonia in furnished rooms, where they found us 3 days later when somebody complained about the smell. We died against bridge abutments, and nobody knew if it was suicide. And we probably didn't know ourselves, except in the sense that it was always suicide. We died in hospitals, our stomachs huge, distended, and there was nothing they could do. We died in cells, never knowing whether we were guilty or not. We went to priests. They gave us pledges. They told us to pray. They told us to go and sin no more, but go. We tried and we died. We died of overdoses. We died in bed but usually not the big bed. We died in straitjackets in the DTs, seeing God knows what creeping, skittering, slithering, shuffling things. And you know what the worst thing was? The worst thing was that nobody ever believed how hard we tried. We went to doctors, and they gave us stuff to take that would make us sick when we drank, on the principle of so crazy it just might work, I guess. Or they sent us places like Dropkick Murphy's. And when we came out, we were hooked on formaldehyde. Or maybe we lied to the doctors. They told us, don't drink so much, just drink like me. And we tried, and we died. We drowned in our own vomit, or choked on it, our broken jaws wired shut. We died playing Russian roulette, and everybody thought we'd lost. We died under the hoofs of horses, under the wheels of vehicles, under the knives and boot heels of our brother drunks. We died in shame. You know what was even worse? Was that we couldn't believe it ourselves, that we had tried. And we died believing that we didn't know what it meant to try. When we were desperate or hopeful or deluded or embattled enough to go for help, we went to people with letters after their names and prayed that they might have read the right books, that had the right words in them, never suspecting the terrifying truth that the right words, as simple as they were, had not been written yet. We died falling off girders on high buildings because of course iron workers drink, of course they do. We died with a shotgun in our mouth or jumping off a bridge, and everybody knew it was suicide. We died under the Southeast Expressway with our hands tied behind us and a bullet in the back of our head because this time the people that we disappointed were the wrong people. We died in convulsions or of insults to the brain, incontinent and in disgrace, abandoned. If we were women, we died degraded because women have so much more to live up to. We tried and we died and nobody cried. And the very worst thing was that for every one of us that died, there were another 100 of us or another 1,000 who wished that we would die, who went to sleep praying we would not have to wake up because what we were enduring was intolerable. And we knew in our hearts it wasn't ever going to change. One day in a hospital room in New York City, one of us had what the books call a transforming spiritual experience. And he said to himself, I've got it. No, you haven't. You've only got part of it. And I have to share it. Now you've almost got it. And he tried to give it away, but we couldn't hear it. The transmission line wasn't open yet. We tried to hear it. We tried and we died. We died of one last cigarette, the comfort of its glowing in the dark. We passed out and the bed caught fire. They said we suffocated before our body burned. They said we never felt a thing. That was the best way, maybe, that we died. Except sometimes we took our family with us. And the man in New York was so sure he had it. He tried to love us into sobriety. But that didn't work either. Love confuses drunks. Still he tried, and still we died. One after another. We got his hopes up, and we broke his heart. Because that's what we do. And the very worst thing of all the worst things was that every time we thought we knew what the worst thing was, something happened that was even worse. Until the day came in a hotel lobby, and it wasn't in Rome or Jerusalem or Mecca or even Dublin or South Boston. It was in Akron, Ohio, for Christ's sake. A day came when the man said, I have to find a drunk because I need him as much as he needs me. Now you've got it. And the transmission line, after all those years, was open. The transmission line was open. And now we don't go to priests and doctors and people with letters after their names. We come to people who have been there. We come to each other. And we try. And we don't have to die.
That was an incredible poem called Drunks. Let me ask you about that poem and some of the people whose picture you painted.
There are a few famous people in the poem. Dylan Thomas, Hemingway, John Berryman jumped off a bridge. But most of the people in the poem, I set out to write it about people who died before there was an AA program to come to. But almost everyone else in the poem was someone that I knew in AA who didn't make it. The first guy in the poem died of pneumonia in furnished rooms where they found us 3 days later when somebody complained about the smell. That was a guy named Dennis M., who bought me breakfast the first Sunday that I was sober in November of 1962, and a week later he was dead. He was sober. He had seen me at meetings. He recognized me from meetings. And he was a guy who had known my father in the program, actually. And he spotted me in this little diner. I had about 35 cents. I was trying to figure out how best to spend it. And he bought me eggs and home fries. And a week later, he was dead. And so on. All through the poem. The guy under the Southeast Expressway with a bullet in the back of his head was a boxer named Tony V. I had met him actually when we put on a meeting at Norfolk State Prison. But I grew up with Tony's brother. Tony's brother was in the 4th grade with me. He probably wouldn't have gotten to the 5th grade if he hadn't copied my math exam. The guy who died of one last cigarette was a guy I didn't know personally, but the story went like wildfire through AA. He lived in Westwood, Massachusetts, a member of the Westwood group, and he had gone out for a one-night stand, and he burned his house down and all his family with him. And
Dylan Thomas reference. Talk a little
Yeah.
bit about that.
Yeah, it's funny that we talked about him before, and now he found his way in here. That's the phrase, we died in convulsions or of insult to the brain. And the phrase insult to the brain is in quotation marks because I'm told that was the cause of death in Dylan Thomas's autopsy. The story is he got stabbed in the eye, or he stabbed himself in the eye by accident with the thorn of a rose. And somehow this turned into a brain infection that killed him. I probably don't have all those facts straight, but I'm pretty sure that the phrase insult to the brain is on the money.
What is your recovery date in 1972?
It was in the middle of April, and I celebrated as April 15th. I'm not certain. I never went back and actually looked at the calendar. It bothers me that my celebration of my recovery date is so close to being the celebration of my slip. But the slip, again, it was something that needed to happen. I was definitely headed in the wrong direction. Thank God I was able to get back. My intention, I didn't want to drink. My intention was to die. I wanted to drink myself to death or, hey, I'm an alcoholic. I'm not going to step in front of a train sober. Just do something to ease the skids. And after one night of drinking, I woke up the next morning and thought, I am not tough enough for this life anymore. I was used to waking up feeling good in the morning for 9.5 years, and there's only one place to go. I had to come back with my hat in my hand and my tail between my legs and start all over again.
What is recovery like for you today, 40 years later? How has it changed? How is it more empowered?
Well, in my own life, recovery is my life. I mean, I didn't expect to live to see 25, and here I am, 73, and counting. In my own life, I cannot separate recovery from life. Recovery is life.
How is your recovery different today than it was 40 years ago?
Oh,
We talk about addiction and alcoholism being progressive in a negative sense. Recovery should be progressive in a positive sense.
absolutely. I did a lot of things wrong in the beginning. And even after I came back, it took me a while to really get into the 12 steps. And consequently, it took me a long time before I felt that the promises were coming true for me. Today, all of those promises have come true. And what you said earlier about the progression, I think my favorite promise is we will intuitively know how to handle situations which used to baffle us. And that was the last one that came true for me. But I think what that promise is saying, back at the beginning, we have to turn our lives over to a sponsor. We cannot trust. When I go into my own head, I'm in dangerous territory. Heard that at a meeting yesterday, and it was as true now as it was then. No, it's not as true now as it was then. Not for me. Because what that promise means is that there comes a point where you can trust your instincts again. The instincts have been there. All of my instincts at the beginning were going to point me toward alcohol if I let them work. Everything in me wanted to drink. It's as though there's a separate entity inside my skull that has one agenda and one agenda only, and it will use any fact, any argument to try to keep me from getting serious about AA. And if I don't have some corrective influence in my life, which is a sponsorship, which is meetings, then that voice is going to take over and have me out the door. I remember the first, I'll say 6 weeks of my sobriety, feeling all day long as though I was in danger, as though I was living right on the edge. 5149 one way, 5149 the other way, never knowing how it was going to break, and thinking, why am I bringing all this effort? I know it's not going to work. And the only time that voice let up was when I would walk inside the doors of an AA meeting. And inside those doors, I would be safe for 2 hours. And the minute I would walk out those doors, the voice was back there again. The minute I walked out into the darkness, the battle started all over again. But I put it at about the 6-week mark. There was one night when I walked out and the voice wasn't there anymore. And from that moment, I began to have some real hope that this thing could work for me.
And now here we are 40 years later. My co-host is Mike Hickey. Mike?
Well, I have so many things that I wanted to touch on, but one thing I wanted to make sure that we don't leave this evening without touching on was this moniker that you've gained over the years of a stand-up poet. I know that there are stand-up comics, and I know that while there are a lot of comedic moments in this manuscript, it's mostly pretty serious kind of stuff. And I just was wondering, is stand-up poet synonymous with your history as a slam poet, as a performance artist?
That's a good question. I actually, when it came time for me to create my own poetry business card, I agonized over what I should call myself, because called myself a poet, people would imagine someone who went off in a room and produced things that you could take off into your room and read.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't the kind of poetry that I was really. If I called myself a performance poet, I felt that sort of implied that everything I did needed to be performed. And I was giving away my right to stand in front of an audience and read a new poem. And that is where it all begins for me, is going in front of an audience with a new poem and finding out that it worked. That's the great excitement. So I came up, and I do think that what we do in I'll call it the live poetry world, I'm all about audience. I'm all about live audience. What does come close to stand-up comedy. But I also grew up in Dorchester with a bunch of guys who appreciate stand-up guys.
Right.
And a stand-up guy is somebody who doesn't rat the rest of the squad out when he goes to prison.
Right. He's loyal.
He's loyal.
Yeah.
And I think we respect stand-up guys where I come from. So the phrase stand-up poetry guy was the phrase that I put on my business card. It's a little ironic now because with my breathing problem, I have to sit down to do my poetry now. But I still think I nailed something when I created that business card.
And your poems have a very conversational, and I mean that in only the best way. I feel we were talking about off the air that a lot of contemporary, I feel like somebody's blowing pipe smoke in my face. It's very dense, it's very obscure. I don't know what the hell they're talking about half the time. And every poem that I've read, I've never gotten to the end thinking to myself, what was that all about? I always felt like this is somebody who has something important to say. And we were talking earlier about the divide between the poets who feel like we should be out there to mystify and, I don't know, confuse the world versus the poets who actually feel like they to say and feel like they want to share it with the world.
Geez, I was at the Edmonton Poetry Festival a couple of years ago. I was speaking. I talked about how the problem with American poetry, especially the last part of the last century, it had devolved into poets writing for each other. The first question I got from the audience was, what's wrong with poets writing for each other? And first thought was to cringe. Oh God, he's got me with that. But the words came out of my mouth before I'd even thought them. I said, there's nothing wrong with it. It just shouldn't be the only thing that's happening.
Right. Exactly.
How has your recovery enhanced your poetry, and how has your poetry enhanced your recovery?
Well, without the recovery, there wouldn't have been any poetry at all. I mean, it's that simple. My disease was such that, I was living in Never Never Land. I was completely in my own head. I remember a few poems that I produced in bar rooms. They are embarrassing to me now. I wish I could just forget them completely, but they're there. Without recovery, there'd be no poetry. The poetry, the combination of the poetry and the recovery. I think the person that I am comes through in my poetry. The person that I am, and the person that I would most like to be. And that personality, that voice that is in the poetry, is shaped by recovery. I have a lot of poems that are about recovery, but I also have a lot of poems that make no mention of recovery. I mean, the great majority of my poems make no mention of recovery. But I think if you read between the lines, you'll hear voices that you might hear at a meeting.
Tell me about Carol. Tell me about the woman who drives you to poetry.
Carol is an amazing woman. She's driving me everywhere today. I'm not in great shape physically anymore. She waits on me hand and foot. When I met her and married her, she turned me into a poet, really. I had given up on poetry, but I made the mistake the first night we met of I was trying to impress Carol. We met through a personal ad. I mentioned in the personal ad that I had had poems published and plays produced, and perhaps she asked something about those poems. I gave her a copy of my life's work, which at that time was about 40 pages. She made a decision that I needed to get serious about writing poetry. After we were married, she blackmailed me into going to a workshop with Galway Cannell. She pushed me into a corner. She said, so the only reason you don't want to go to this workshop is the money. And I said, oh, of course that's the only reason. She said, you're not the least little bit afraid to go to the workshop? I said, of course I'm not afraid. She said, then I'll pay for it. And she had me.
Damn.
And that got me started. Actually, the poem Drunks was written about 3 months after that workshop. And there were a couple of poems written at the workshop that I still do on occasion. But that got me started. What really got me going, though, was when I discovered the open mic movement, which was about a year later than that. But Carol has been an incredible support and a pusher. She gets me to do things that that I would not normally have the courage to do. I don't like to put myself out there too much. I don't like to force myself on people. I don't self-promote very well. With Carol's help, I get to do things that I would never have attempted otherwise. She is an amazing support. Next to recovery itself, the best life decision I ever made.
How long have you been married?
21 years.
Wow.
Second marriage for me.
And you know, they say that the addiction, the disease of alcoholism is a family disease. But what oftentimes doesn't get talked about, which does get talked about on Recovery Coast to Coast very often, is that it really helps to have a support system at home. Somebody who understands, somebody who knows that it's going to be a trigger if somebody leaves a 12-pack of beer sitting in the refrigerator or something like that. And it sounds like Carol has been a really good support team for you.
Oh, absolutely. Her father was an alcoholic who did not get sober in the program. He did ultimately stop drinking. He was on the marijuana maintenance program. But her life as a child was growing up with an alcoholic father was pretty horrendous. And so she comes in with a great respect for AA and sobriety.
Tell me about the wedding of Kathleen and Mark.
Would you like to hear the poem?
Absolutely.
By the way, I got a call from Kathleen this morning. She just found out that her second child which will be coming in January, will be her second son. Her first son, he's named after me. Kathleen asked me to write a poem for her wedding, which was about 7 or 8 years ago. And this is the poem I wrote. It's called Epithalamion, a few words for Kathleen. We're here today to celebrate the wedding of Kathleen and Mark. Kathleen, when she was 8 years old, started coming with me to AA meetings on Friday nights. That group had really good coffee. And as she would make her way time after time to the coffee pot, I would lose sight of Kathleen because she was short. But I could follow her progress by watching the heads turn to bless her with their eyes as she passed, beautiful child that she was. At the break, they would raffle off a big book. And when the meeting broke up, Kathleen would go from table to table, collecting all the discarded raffle tickets, which she would bring home and store in a shoebox. Why? I never figured it out. Up came my anniversary, and my sponsor was out of town. So I asked Kathleen if she'd be willing to say a few words in front of a room full of grown-ups, and she was game. Kathleen was always game. She had to stand on a chair to reach the microphone. And if I remember right, what she said was, "It is always an occasion when someone celebrates their 11th anniversary." Jack? And if I had been expecting something a little more, what, personal? Still, it was a great beginning for a 10-year run. The next year, she didn't need to stand on the chair. She wrote a poem that began, "My dad is the best. He's been that way since birth. It's a shame there's only one of him on the planet Earth." Kathleen's presence those Friday nights lit up that big gymnasium. And a lot of people who never got to watch their own kids grow up came to look forward to her presentations as a highlight of their year. Tom G., who couldn't come with us when we put on meetings in prisons, said to me, "That kid is the best advertisement for this program that anyone could ever see." And Billy T., a former 300-pound biker, told me he had a daughter Kathleen's age somewhere, and every year he would cry at her presentation. But it was the good cry. Now it's my turn to say a few words for Kathleen, but she's tied my hands a little, made me promise not to make her cry. So I'll address my comments to the groom. Probably most fathers of the bride, if they were honest, would admit that they don't think there's a young man in the world who's worthy of their little girl. I want Mark to know that I don't feel that way, particularly. Still, what I'm sure of is that Kathleen and Mark have been extraordinarily lucky to find each other. It's crazy out there. Most of us feel fortunate to find anyone willing to cast their lot with us, let alone the right person. Today, my heart is telling me that this is right. Now, Mark, about the dowry. I'm afraid I have to ask to be dispensed from that particular archaic tradition. It's not that I'm ungenerous, just unemployed. But somewhere among Kathleen's belongings, in a cellar or an attic or at the bottom of a closet, you might still find a shoebox full of raffle tickets that didn't win anything. If you find it, Mark, hang on to it. A lot of hopes went into that box. The hopes of people whose last names I never knew. People who didn't win life's lotteries, didn't dodge all of life's bullets, who once looked at Kathleen and took heart, who loved her and left their tickets on the tables in hope that they might be for her tickets to a better life than they had had. And anytime you feel that life's too hard and you're too much alone, take that box out. Run your fingers through those old raffle tickets. Mix them up real good. And think about how much luck it takes to find the one person in the world that we were meant to find. Then go to the kitchen and put on a pot of some really good coffee and make enough for two.
One of America's great poets. My co-host tonight is Mike Hickey. Mike?
So I would like if we could get back to poetry a little bit. I was wondering what some of the artistic influences have been in your life. You talked about Dylan Thomas. Are there any, and Galway Kinnell, of course, one of the preeminent poets in America today. Are there any other major poets that have influenced you?
First of all, before I answer that question, I have to say I want your audience to understand that if you are going through your list of America's great poets and trying to figure out which one I am, I'm probably not on your radar yet. But it's nice to be called one of America's great poets. I won't argue. I won't argue with that.
Never argue with the host.
Right.
It doesn't go well.
Now, your question again.
Your influences, yeah.
You know, my first book, I listed my influences as Dylan Thomas, Robert Frost, and Garrison Keillor. Um, I actually shook hands with Robert Frost when I was 18. I have a poem about that. And Thomas, I've already told the story of
Right.
Child's Christmas in Wales. But it was Garrison Keillor on Prairie Home Companion who taught me the entertainment potential of simple storytelling. And a lot of the people who talk about my poems use the word storyteller in preference to the word poet. Almost all my poems do have a strong narrative thread. And the reason I think my poems are long is that, you know, most lyric poems will function on some kind of metaphor. This thing is like that thing. My poems will function on this story is like that story. But to make that point, I have to tell both stories first. And it's longer than describing two flowers or,
Right.
you know, or a flower and a bobcat.
Yeah, right. And of course, the rooms of AA are replete with lots of amazing stories. In fact, you have a poem called The Story. We all share, anybody in recovery has the story. There are simply different machinations of that story.
Our stories disclose.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In fact, I'll tell you a story. When I went back to Dartmouth in 1964, I was still very disorganized. I was late filing for my classes. I was signed up for 3 classes. 2 of the classes, there was only one, and I hadn't because I was late, I didn't get my schedule by the first day of classes. It wasn't ready yet. Now, 2 of my classes, there was only one option, so I knew what to go to. The 3rd class, though, was creative writing. There were 3 options for that. The reason I wanted to take creative writing was I thought I might want to tell some of the stories that I'd heard in AA. There's so much material there.
Right.
I picked one of the 3 classes. There's one that was taught by a guy named Chauncey Loomis. And I thought, oh, I always end up with teachers with names like Chauncey Loomis.
Great name.
Who actually turned out to be a terrific guy, by the way. But I wasn't in his class. So the next day I got my schedule and I realized I had gone to the wrong class. And I was going to have to seek out the right teacher and find out what had happened in the first class and what he had assigned for next week. And I did. I went to the English department. I knocked on the door and I walk in. Boy says, come in. And there's this cocky-looking guy sitting behind a desk, tilted back in a swivel chair, playing with a pencil. And he looks at his class directory, class of 61. And knowing that this is now 1964, he says, where have you been for 5 years?
You're 5 years late.
And what have you been doing? And I started to say, I said, well, I've been doing this and that, none of it very long, none of it very well. But then I thought, wait a minute, I want to write about AA. And these writing teachers always tell you, write about what you know. So I might as well tell this guy that this is what I know. So I said, my problem when I was here before was that I was an alcoholic. And the swivel chair came down and the pencil hit the desk. He said, you're kidding. And I thought, oh, a wise guy. Next thing he's going to say is, isn't everybody here an alcoholic?
Right.
But I went ahead and I said, and 2 years ago I got into AA and I've been putting my life together one piece at a time. And this is how far I've gotten at this point. Well, he sat back in the chair and he commenced to tell me his story. He had dropped out of college the same age that I had dropped out because of alcohol. Gone back sober the same age that I was coming back sober. And gone through college and grad school with straight A's in California. This was his first teaching job. He had been in New England for 6 days, had not made an AA connection yet, and out of 3,000 students and 500 faculty, I had walked into his office and said, I'm an alcoholic.
There are no coincidences, God incidences.
I got an A in the course. I had been so afraid that I wasn't going to be able to make it because Dartmouth was a big drinking school, and there were a lot of people there who remembered me from the first time around, and I did not want to face those people. And nobody from Boston had gone back to college full time at that point. When you do something for the first time, you don't know whether it's possible or not. So I was really scared. And, from that moment, I knew I was in the right place. I made the right decision.
Right. Wow.
You mentioned Boston. Tell me your memories of Kenmore Square.
Kenmore Square. Well, it's pretty close to Fenway Park. I have a lot of memories of Fenway Park. I have a poem called Kenmore Square, which, when I wrote it, I wasn't thinking there was an AA connection at all. It's a true story. I knew a poet who would make a couple hundred copies of a poem and stick them in a pouch, like a mailman who wrote all the mail himself. Saturday mornings, he would walk Commonwealth Avenue from the public gardens all the way to Kenmore Square, smile at everyone he met, and offer each a poem. Most people accepted them. At Kenmore, he would turn and start back Commonwealth, conscientious to retrace the same side of that gracious boulevard. And he would reclaim his poems from the sidewalks and the gutters where they'd been discarded, and he would stuff the pieces back into his pouch. We watch others go through life, leaving bodies strewn behind, and wonder vaguely what our own trail looks like. Bless those brave enough actually to walk that backward track. They walk it for us all.
You have been in long-term recovery 40 years. You've been in the program 50 years and had that one slip. Fast forward to today and this particular point in time. In December of 2010, you had some colon cancer surgery. How is your health today? What is life like?
Well, last time I talked to my oncologist, he said, cancer is the least of your worries. Now, that sounds like really good news coming from an oncologist until you think about it. But the cancer has pretty well all been caught and dealt with early. But I now have a breathing problem, and nobody's quite sure exactly what's causing it. Nobody has told me that I have 6 months to live or give me any number like that. But they have told me that if there are things I want to do them now. Don't wait 6 months hoping that you'll feel better. So I've been doing a lot of those things. The scary thing is that they started telling me that about 6 months ago, but I'm still feeling like I've got a way to run. I've got a way to go. As long as this breathing doesn't get any worse, I'm getting better at strategies for dealing with it. I'm getting a little more adventurous about getting out and doing the things that matter to me. And I have a book of recovery poems that we're working on that will be published under the name John X if I'm still alive when it's ready for release, and they'll have my actual name on them if I'm dead when the book is ready. We're prepared for all contingencies at this point. I'm okay with this. To me, death, I have a poem I wrote recently in which I describe it as the next great adventure. And that's the way I feel about it. I don't like pain, but death in principle never scared me all that much.
How do you want to be remembered?
I think of that recovery book as my legacy. I would like to be remembered by that book and some of these poems more than anything else. It's funny though, I recently had a book release and what was generously described as a roast in Seattle. And some have said it was more like a testimonial than a roast, and it really was. It was, if a few people hadn't actually roasted me, it would have gotten embarrassing. What you expect to hear from other poets is how much your poetry has influenced them, how much it has inspired them. If they're going to say something good about you, that's what you think you're going to hear. And instead, I was hearing random acts of kindness, many of which I didn't even remember doing. I don't mind being remembered that way either. I think it says a lot. It says a lot about my program.
I was at that event, and I'll never forget there was a young girl. I want to say she was 15 or 16, and she was a performance poet, and I don't remember her name. And she came up and she said something along the lines of it was her first performance, and she was terrified, and she had practiced so hard and tried to really nail it, and she felt like she was just a disaster on stage. And as she was walking off stage feeling, "Oh, well, I'll never do this again," you had come, she was almost out of the building the way she made it sound. You had come up to her and said, "That was really good. You're going to be really good. Keep working hard at it." And she said that completely turned her attitude around. And I could tell when she was saying it, I kept shooting a look over to you and Carol, and I could tell that it was probably something that you didn't even remember saying. But it had this incredible impact on that young woman. And when I've heard her poetry since online, and she's a powerful poet, and you really gave her that little oomph, that little extra push in terms of finding her voice. And so that's a pretty tremendous legacy to go along with all this great poetry.
You know, that's something. I once sponsored a guy who came to me with a question about the spiritual awakening.
Hmm.
He wondered, he said, I know this is a stupid question, but because I never heard anybody say it before. It's just my idea. And he said, do you think the spiritual awakening could have anything to do with listening, learning to listen? And I thought, my God, he's on to something. Because when I came into this program, I didn't listen to anybody. One thing that AA and the open mic movement have in common is one person at a time talks and everybody else listens. And there's a respect in that listening. When I first started going to open mics, I would sit there and they'd be calling the names one at a time. And I'd be sitting there thinking, not my turn, not my turn, not my turn. My turn! Now it's my turn. And, people would come up to me on occasion and say, I really like that poem. And I would wish that I could say something about their poem, but I hadn't been listening. So I started listening. And the connection between AA and open mics is that nobody will ever, no matter how off the wall you are, nobody ever is going to tell you to shut up. People will listen, and they might say keep coming. They might say yeah, you get a lot of keep coming in the beginning.
Yeah.
But they'll listen to you, and I learned to listen in AA, and that carries over with me into the poetry world. And I do. When I sit at an open mic, I take notes. I try to write down the name of the poet. If the poem has a title, I'll write that down. Because if I see them 3 weeks later and I really liked their poem, I will want to be able to say something, but I won't be able to remember what the poem was.
Right.
And it really defeats the purpose to say, I really enjoyed that unmemorable poem you did a couple of weeks ago.
And we talk about in the program, to keep it, you got to give it away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think we're not fully cognizant of the fact that just one word, one phrase, one compliment at the right time can really bolster somebody's spirit,
Yeah.
What is the role of spirituality in your recovery?
It's enormous. I spend a lot of time every day in prayer, and I'm not praying for myself, and it's not something new since I started having the illness. It's something that I've been doing for years. Basically, I had a problem when I first came in. That's one of the voices was telling me to get out of this program because I was a Catholic, and these people said the Protestant Our Father. You know, the God that they talked about was not the God that I had grown up with. It was a different God. It would be a violation of my Catholicism to keep going to this thing. And that was a battle for me. It really was. And one day, you know, I had an insight, and I swear I can remember where I was, and I was coming out of a smoke shop on Broadway in South Boston, and it hit me that no God I ever heard of would want me to destroy myself with alcohol. So give this thing a try. Now, since then, I've had my differences with the Catholic Church. The phrase darkening the door comes to mind. I did call myself in one of my book titles a relapsing, remitting Catholic, but the relapse is over. I'm not going back at this point. That's another issue entirely, though. But what has happened over the years in terms of spirituality? The God that I believe in today is the God that I meet around the table at AA meetings. That's the stories that I hear. I hear God's voice. I absolutely believe that when we stand up at the end of the meeting and join hands, God's hand is in that circle. Every meeting, every week, every day. That's where my God lives.
Before we wrap this up, what advice do you have for newcomers today who may look at you enamored of 40 years, and yet they're trying to struggle and get 24 hours?
It gets better. It gets easier. All you have to do is survive these first days and keep putting one foot in front of the other. Do the things that you're told. Don't try to reinvent the program. If you do those things, it is inevitable that one day you will come into the promises. Those promises are for real. They're for real. Every one of them has come true in my life. Keep coming. It works. It works if you work it.
And work it, you're worth it.
Yeah.
We always say the bright side of alcoholism is recovery, and you certainly embrace that fully. Mike, I thank you for your time as co-host. Nice to have you with us, and thank you so much for your story tonight.
It has been a real pleasure talking with you. Thank you for having me on. And you out there listening, thank you for the gift of your listening.
I'm Neil Scott, the program Recovery Coast to Coast. Das Vidania. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with the great Jack McCarthy. I became very close to Jack in his dying days and produced a video tribute to him, which you will find in the show notes, along with information on purchasing the book. By the way, I want to remind listeners of the podcast that if you would like to tell your story of recovery, regardless of the path that you've chosen, as long as you have been in continuous recovery for a year or more, drop us a note at recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Award-winning actress Ali McGraw is coming up next, sharing some thoughts about self-worth and more. We'll do that in just 30 seconds.
Alcohol is running your life. You want help, but can't take time away from work to get it. Where do you turn? Contact Sundown M Ranch. Sundown M Ranch outpatient programs have helped thousands recover from addiction without losing time on the job. Nationally recognized for innovative, effective, and affordable treatment programs, Sundown M Ranch will help you put your life back on track. Go to www.sundown.org to learn more.
And now, as promised, here is Ali McGraw with thoughts on self-worth and more.
When I look at the person I am today, I appreciate what I see. I accept myself. I care about myself. I value myself. Because I want to continue feeling this way, I choose to think self-affirming rather than self-deprecating thoughts. I tell myself, I can do it. I'm capable. I deserve it. I'm worthy. In the past, the way I felt about myself was determined by the deeds and messages of those around me. Today, I know that I alone am responsible for my sense of worth. It's up to me to develop the attitudes and take the actions that will keep me feeling good about myself. Now that I've come to know and respect my true self, I no longer have to hide behind masks, walls, or possessions. My life decisions, including where to live, what to wear, what to own, are motivated by what is good and right for me, what will make me happy, what my real needs are. Self-worth helps me to be comfortable and open around other people, and to be confident in what I do. Especially exciting is the prospect of what I am becoming, of what still lies ahead. Thought for today. As I heal, I develop an increasing sense of worth from the inside out.
And before we wrap up the podcast, I want to read from Jack McCarthy's wonderful book, Drunks and Other Poems of Recovery. This poem is called The Story. Heard once at an AA meeting, never forgotten. We are like an island of shipwreck survivors. Every night we gather around the fire and tell our stories. And the more we tell our stories, the clearer it becomes. It isn't many stories that we're telling, it's the story. Oh, sure, the details change from one telling to another. But from the beginning, everyone around the fire knows where the story goes, and where the story always goes. And every once in a while, we sit around the fire, listening, and then a cry comes from the beach. We rush down to where another survivor has washed up on the shore. We pump the water out of him and roll him over, and his eyes open and he sees all of us looking down at him. And he says, "You're not going to believe the things that have been happening in my life." And then we say, "Try us." And he begins to talk. And as he talks, we look at each other and we nod, because he knows the story. That wraps up this edition of the National Podcast, Recovery Coast to Coast. If you've enjoyed the podcast, and I certainly hope that you have, please share it with others, perhaps via social media, or simply by telling someone about it. You can find all of our podcasts at recoverycoasttocoast.org. And if you'd like to get in touch, again, our email, recoverycoasttocoast@comcast.net. Also, please hit the follow button. It's free, and you'll be notified the next time we publish a podcast. And remember, if you know someone who is experiencing problems with alcohol or any other drug, here is that 24-hour national helpline that offers free information and confidential treatment referrals. Spanish-speaking individuals are available as well. It's 1-800-622-HELP. And join us next time for America's Voice for Recovery, Recovery Coast to Coast, the National Podcast. And be sure and check out our previous podcasts, including the one with Bonnie Raitt, the interview with NFL legend Thomas Hollywood Henderson, and actor John Larroquette, and many others. Simply go to recoverycoasttocoast.org. And another shout out to our sponsoring organization, Sundown M Ranch, where recovery begins. Sundown.org. I'm Neil Scott, reminding you to stay healthy, live in gratitude, and be kind to one another. Remember, the bright side of addiction is recovery. Pass it on.